Franklin Harris, an 85-year-old retired Marine, is assaulted in a supermarket parking lot after accidentally brushing a biker's motorcycle. The biker, Derek Morgan, punches Frank, leaving him bloodied and ignored by passersby. His groceries scatter, his veteran's cap falls, and his pride is wounded. Yet, a store clerk, Luis, witnesses the injustice and texts Frank's son, Captain Matt Harris. As Frank sits alone, military engines rumble in the distance. Matt and his soldiers arrive, not for vengeance, but to restore honor. The confrontation unfolds, hinting at justice, as the town begins to see Frank's true legacy. If Frank's story of resilience and honor moved you, join us at TT Hero Stories. Hit like, subscribe, and share to celebrate unsung heroes. Your voice matters. Comment your thoughts on respecting veterans and elders. Let's inspire change together by remembering those who serve quietly among us. Franklin Harris, an 85-year-old man with a weathered face etched by time, moved through the world with a quiet dignity that few noticed anymore. His hands, gnarled by arthritis and trembling faintly, brushed against a parked motorcycle as he shuffled past it in the supermarket parking lot. The contact was barely a whisper, a fleeting moment that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to Franklin, it was enough to stir a pang of guilt in his chest. His steps faltered, slow and deliberate, as he turned to face the bike's owner, a young man with a hardened scowl. "I'm sorry, son," Franklin said, his voice soft but earnest, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime's humility. No harm meant. His pale blue eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with sincerity, sought forgiveness for the unintentional slight. The biker, a wiry figure in a leather jacket, didn't pause to consider the old man's apology. His anger flared like a match struck in the dark, and without a word he swung his fist. The punch landed hard against Franklin's cheek, a brutal force that sent the elderly man crashing to the asphalt. Pain exploded in his face, hot and disorienting, as his grocery bags spilled across the pavement, apples rolling into the gutter, a loaf of bread crushed underfoot. Blood trickled down his temple, warm against his cold skin, and his veteran's cap, a faded emblem of his service, tumbled to the ground beside him. Franklin's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a deep, aching sorrow. He had faced worse than this, far worse. But the sting of this moment cut differently. It wasn't the pain that hurt most. It was the indifference of the onlookers. Shoppers passed by, their eyes darting to his worn Marine jacket before sliding away, as if his presence were an inconvenience. No one stopped. No one helped. Alone on the cold pavement, Franklin gathered himself with the same resolve that had carried him through decades of war. His hands shook as he retrieved his cap, clutching it like a lifeline to the pride he refused to let slip away. He hauled himself to a nearby bench, each movement a battle against the stiffness in his joints and the bruise blooming across his face. Sitting there, blood still seeping from his split lip, he felt the weight of invisibility more acutely than ever. Once he had been a force, a man whose presence commanded respect. Now he was just an old man, overlooked and discarded. Yet even in that moment of humiliation, Franklin's spirit remained unbroken. He sat straighter, his gaze steady, holding on to the fragments of honor that no fist could shatter. 30 minutes later, the distant rumble of engines broke the quiet of the parking lot. The sound grew louder, a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the air. Heads turned as a military convoy rolled into view, a procession of armored vehicles led by a Humvee. At its helm stood a commander in crisp dress blues, his posture rigid with purpose. The convoy came to a halt, and the commander stepped down, his polished boots clicking against the asphalt. His face, lined with the same quiet strength as Franklin's, softened as his eyes found his father on the bench. This was no mission of vengeance. It was a declaration of respect, a reminder to the world of what Franklin Harris stood for, not just today, but always. Franklin hadn't always been the frail figure who navigated supermarket aisles with a cloth tote bag slung over his shoulder, gripping it like a soldier clutching a rifle in a storm. Decades ago, he had been the storm itself, a United States Marine whose courage shielded the innocent from danger. For 32 years, he served in 3 wars, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, each leaving scars on his body and deeper wounds in his soul. He enlisted in 1969, a wide-eyed 18-year-old with a fresh buzz cut and boots that swallowed his feet. Within months, he was wading through the Mekong Delta, mud sucking at his legs as bullets whistled overhead. He dragged wounded brothers from rice paddies, his heart hammering with the raw terror of youth, yet his hands never wavered. Vietnam taught him the fragility of life. Iraq showed him the chaos of a world unraveling. Afghanistan tested his endurance, grinding down his body but never his will. Through every deployment, Franklin sought not glory but purpose. Medals meant little to him. Duty meant everything. That unshakable belief cost him dearly. Friends lost to gunfire, years stolen from his family, and pieces of his heart that never fully healed. He retired as a master gunnery sergeant, a rank earned through sweat, sacrifice, and an unrelenting commitment to his men. But when asked about his service, he spoke not of his own achievements, but of those who never came home. His voice would grow quiet, reverent, as he touched the worn Marine jacket he wore every winter. "This was Mike's," he'd say, his fingers tracing the faded fabric. Mike, a young Marine who served with him in Fallujah, had taken shrapnel meant for Franklin, dying with blood on his hands and courage in his heart. The jacket, returned with Mike's belongings, became Franklin's way of carrying in his friend's memory, a tangible reminder of the honor they shared. Now Franklin's life was a quieter battle. He lived in a modest apartment just off Main Street, where the walls held photographs of comrades and campaigns long past. Each morning began with black coffee, a handful of pills for his aching joints, and a grocery list scrawled in shaky handwriting. He saluted the flag at sunrise, a private ritual that anchored him to the man he'd always been. His old dress boots, polished to a mirror shine, sat unused in his closet, a relic of a life Frank Harris pulled on his old Marine Corps jacket, the faded fabric heavy with the weight of memories. The sear fee patch, its edges frayed but still proud, clung to the sleeve like a badge of honor. It was too warm for the jacket, the late spring sun already pressing down on the small town, but Frank didn't care. The jacket was more than cloth. It was his tether to a life that still made sense, a shield against the days when his hands trembled too much, or the silence in his cramped apartment grew suffocating. Each morning as he zipped it up, he felt the ghosts of his past settle around him, steadying his uneven steps. Today, his mission was simple: bread and milk, just the essentials. He grabbed a reusable grocery bag, its canvas worn thin from years of use, and headed out to the supermarket. The parking lot buzzed with chaos when he arrived. Cars jockeyed for spaces, their drivers distracted, eyes glued to glowing phone screens. Shopping carts clattered past, pushed by people who moved as if the world beyond their personal bubble didn't exist. Frank, though, took his time. His knees weren't what they used to be. Decades of service had worn them down, and sharp turns felt like a gamble he couldn't afford. Every step was deliberate, calculated, a quiet act of defiance against the body that was slowly betraying him. He didn't mind the slow pace. It gave him time to notice things others missed, like the row of motorcycles parked near the store's entrance, their chrome catching the sunlight. One bike, a sleek black beast polished to a mirror shine, stood out like it belonged in a museum, not on a cracked sidewalk. Frank's eyes lingered on it, a flicker of admiration passing through him. He'd always liked machines that looked like they could outrun time itself. He didn't realize how close he'd drifted until his grocery bag brushed the bike's handlebar. The machine rocked slightly, just enough to make the plastic milk bottle in his bag shift and clink against the loaf of bread. The sound was small, insignificant, but to Frank, it was a siren. He froze, heart sinking like a stone in his chest. He turned, scanning the lot, his voice steady but soft as he spoke to no one in particular. "I'm sorry, son. Didn't mean any harm." His eyes searched for the owner, hoping to explain, to make it right. He didn't have to look far. Across the lot, a group of bikers lounged against the supermarket's brick wall, their laughter cutting through the morning air. They were a rough bunch, leather-clad, their coffee cups steaming in their hands. But one of them, a towering figure, broad-shouldered, with tattoos snaking from his wrists up to his neck, locked eyes with Frank. The laughter died abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. The biker's gaze was cold, predatory, and Frank felt a familiar twist in his gut, the kind he hadn't felt since his days in combat. "You touched my bike," the man growled, his voice low and menacing as he stepped forward, closing the distance with alarming speed. Frank straightened, his spine stiffening out of instinct. "It was an accident," he said calmly, his tone carrying the weight of a man who'd faced worse than an angry stranger. "No damage done." But his words didn't land. The biker didn't care. Rage flashed in the man's eyes, and before Frank could brace himself, a fist flew through the air. The blow struck hard, a brutal force against Frank's cheek, sending him reeling. His legs buckled, and he crumpled to the pavement, the world tilting violently. His grocery bag hit the ground with a sickening thud, the milk bottle shattering, its contents pooling across the asphalt like spilled blood. The bread tumbled out, soft and defenseless, crushed beneath his hip as he fell. His veteran's cap, the one with the golden marine emblem, rolled a few feet away, landing face up in a patch of sunlight, its proud insignia glinting as if waiting for someone to notice. For a moment, the world went quiet. Frank's ears rang, his vision swimming as he lay there, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. Blood trickled from his nose and lip, warm against his skin. He didn't move. Not yet. His mind, sharpened by years of training, told him to assess, to endure, to wait. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was home, a parking lot in the middle of an ordinary morning, and the realization stung worse than the punch. Around him, the crowd kept moving. Shoppers hurried past, their eyes darting away, avoiding the crumpled old man on the ground. A teenager glanced back, his face flickering with something like guilt before he turned and kept walking. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, whispering something sharp as they veered away. The biker, meanwhile, chuckled, a low, cruel sound, and sauntered back to his group as if nothing had happened. To him, Frank was just a momentary inconvenience, a blip in his day. Frank's hands shook as he pushed himself up, his palms scraping against the rough asphalt. His body ached, but it was the abandonment that cut deeper. No one stopped. No one helped. The supermarket doors slid open and closed, a rhythmic whoosh that mocked his isolation. A young employee, barely more than a kid, stepped halfway out the door, his eyes meeting Frank's for a fleeting moment. Frank saw the hesitation in the boy's face, the brief spark of concern, but then he retreated back inside, as if Frank's pain was a problem too big to touch. The scattered groceries lay around him like the wreckage of something sacred. Milk soaking into his pants, bread flattened, his cap lying just out of reach, its emblem catching the light like a silent plea. But what no one in that parking lot knew was that a single pair of eyes had seen it all. A quiet store clerk, fresh out of college, stood just inside the supermarket, her fingers trembling as she typed a single word into her phone. Commander. The message was sent to a contact labeled simply, Commander, it's your father. She didn't know Frank personally, but she knew enough, knew the stories that clung to that jacket, knew the weight of the emblem on his cap. Her heart raced as she watched him, slumped on the curb, blood staining his weathered face. She felt a pang of helplessness, but also a spark of resolve. Someone had to know. Someone had to care. Frank sat there, his breath uneven, his mind a storm of memories and pain. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call out for help. Decades of war had taught him to endure, to wait for the next move, to trust his instincts. But this wasn't a battlefield, and the rules were different here. The indifference of the crowd, the casual cruelty of the biker, the way his cap lay ignored on the pavement, it all felt like a betrayal deeper than any wound he'd ever taken. Yet even as the world moved on around him, Frank's resolve held firm. He was a Marine. He'd faced worse. And somewhere deep inside, he knew he wasn't as alone as he felt. Frank Harris reached for the tattered handkerchief tucked in his pocket, its edges worn thin from years of use. The faded Marine Corps emblem, stitched with care into one corner, caught the dim light. A cherished gift from his late wife, Margaret, given before her illness stole her away. His trembling fingers pressed the cloth to his chin, wiping away the warm trickle of blood. It wasn't about hiding the injury. Frank had long since stopped caring about appearances. It was about dignity, about holding on to the pride that had carried him through jungles and deserts. He refused to let the world see him as a broken man, even if, in this moment, that's exactly what he felt like. The stain of her cut paled compared to the ache in his chest, a deep, hollow pain born not from the punch that had floored him, but from the indifference of the quiet American town around him. He wasn't back in Vietnam, where his brothers in arms would have hauled him from the line of fire without a second thought, their hands steady and their loyalty fiercer than the bullets whizzing past. He wasn't in Fallujah, where the chaos of explosions forged bonds tighter than steel, where a Marine never left another behind. No, he was here, in a small town where the sidewalks were clean and the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, and not a single person had stopped to help. That betrayal cut deeper than any blade. The world had passed him by, leaving him bleeding on the pavement, a forgotten relic of wars no one seemed to care about anymore. Frank's jaw tightened as he fought the wave of despair threatening to swallow him. He'd faced death too many times to let this break him, but the loneliness, the sheer weight of being unseen, was a battle he hadn't trained for. A young woman pushing a stroller approached, her steps slowing as she neared him. Her toddler, strapped in with a sippy cup clutched in tiny hands, stared at Frank with unblinking eyes, curious and unafraid. The mother's gaze darted to the blood on his face, then away, her lips pressing into a thin line. She tugged the stroller closer, shielding her child as if Frank's pain were contagious. "Don't look, sweetie," she murmured, her voice low but sharp, laced with unease. Frank didn't catch the words, but the tone pierced him like a shard of glass, fearful, dismissive, as though he were something to be avoided. Not a man who'd once carried the weight of freedom on his shoulders. In that moment, he felt like a ghost, a shadow cast by a life no one wanted to acknowledge. His chest tightened, and he forced himself to look away, focusing on the cracked pavement beneath his boots. He wouldn't beg for their pity. He never had. But one pair of eyes didn't turn away. From behind the smudged glass of the supermarket window, Luis Thompson watched, his heart pounding in his chest. A quiet young man who stocked shelves through the night to scrape together tuition for community college. Luis had seen it all, the sudden violence of the punch, or perhaps the stumble that sent Frank sprawling, and the way the crowd had parted around him, their steps quickening as if his suffering were an inconvenience. Luis didn't know Frank by name, but he recognized the weathered Marine jacket. Its olive drab faded but unmistakable. His grandfather had worn one just like it, the same proud emblem pinned to his chest until the day he died. That jacket told a story of sacrifice, of battles fought and survived, and it stirred something deep in Luis, a mix of respect and guilt that he hadn't acted sooner. His hands shook as he stood frozen behind the register, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing in his ears. He hadn't confronted the biker who'd thrown the punch. He wasn't that brave, or maybe he was just practical. He hadn't rushed outside to help, knowing he was no match for the leather-clad crew loitering in the parking lot. But he couldn't just stand there either. With a deep breath, Luis pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. He opened his contacts and found the one saved simply as Commander. His fingers moved quickly, typing a message that was short but heavy with urgency. "Sir, it's your father. He's been hurt. Someone hit him." He hesitated for a split second, then pressed send, his eyes flicking back to the window. Frank was still there, struggling to rise, his face a mask of stubborn resolve. Luis's stomach twisted with a mix of hope and fear. Hope that help would come, fear that it might be too late. Outside, Frank pressed the handkerchief to his mouth one last time, the metallic taste of blood lingering on his tongue. He braced himself against the bench, his knees trembling, but his spirit unyielding. He didn't have the strength to stand, not really, but he'd be damned if he let the world see him crawl. Pride was all he had left, and he clung to it like a lifeline. He didn't know that help was already on its way, summoned by a stranger's quiet act of courage. The parking lot had returned to its mundane rhythm, cars pulling in and out, shoppers chatting about grocery lists and weekend plans. The biker who'd struck him was back with his crew, their laughter grating against Frank's ears, as if the violence had been nothing more than a passing amusement. To them, Frank was just an old man who'd gotten in their way. The world had moved on, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. Far down the road, a low rumble broke through the hum of everyday life. Not the drone of commuter traffic, but the deep, purposeful growl of engines built for battle, not errands. The sound grew louder, turning heads in the parking lot, a vibration that seemed to pulse through the asphalt itself. Dust swirled in the air that as a convoy emerged from behind the strip mall, moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. A sleek black SUV led the way, flanked by three military Humvees, their dark green hulls glinting in the afternoon sun. They didn't roar or screech. They didn't need to. Their presence commanded attention, a silent declaration of authority that hushed the chatter around the supermarket entrance. The lead SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of the lot, and its door opened with a deliberate slowness that seemed to pause the world around it. A man stepped out, his digital camouflage boots striking the pavement with a sharp click. Captain Matthew Harris stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his face carved from stone. His jaw was clenched, his eyes unreadable behind a mask of disciplined calm, but beneath it, a storm raged. He was a man who didn't negotiate with chaos. He ended it. His gaze swept the parking lot, taking in every detail. The shoppers frozen mid-step, the biker crew now silent, their bravado fading under the weight of his presence. Then he saw his father. Frank sat on the bench, his jacket rumpled, his face bruised and bloodied, struggling to hold himself upright. The sight hit Matthew like a gut punch. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the knuckles whitening, but he didn't falter. Every muscle in his body screamed, rushed to his father's side to shield him from the world that had dared to hurt him. But he moved with purpose, not panic. His boots pounded the asphalt, each step a heartbeat, a promise to make this right. Behind him, 12 soldiers disembarked from the Humvees, their movements silent but synchronized. They fanned out across the lot, taking positions near exits, doorways, and corners, their eyes sharp and their stances unyielding. They carried no weapons. None were needed. Their presence was enough, a living wall of resolve that spoke louder than any gunfire. Matthew reached his father, his heart twisting as he took in the damage. The swollen cheek, the blood-streaked chin, the exhaustion etched into every line of Frank's face. But even now, Frank's eyes held a spark of defiance, a refusal to be pitied. Matthew knelt beside him, his voice low but steady, a lifeline thrown across the years of distance between them. "I'm here, Dad," he said, and in those three words was a vow. No one would hurt him again, not while Matthew drew breath. The parking lot was still, the air thick with the weight of what had just begun. The bikers shifted uneasily, their laughter long gone. Shoppers watched from a distance, their curiosity tinged with awe. Luis, still behind the supermarket window, let out a shaky breath, his phone still clutched in his hand. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he'd done the right thing. For Frank, for the jacket, for the grandfather he'd lost too soon. And for Matthew, the rumble of those engines was more than a sound. It was the echo of duty, of family, of a bond that no amount of blood or time could break. The moment hung heavy in the air, a sudden stillness that seemed to choke the life out of Lincoln Plaza. The hum of casual chatter, the rustle of shopping bags, the distant clatter of carts. It all stopped, as if the world itself had caught its breath. Shoppers stood frozen, their eyes darting toward the source of the disruption. Matt Harris, a captain in the military, felt his heart lurch as he dropped to one knee beside his father, Frank, who lay crumpled on the pavement outside the supermarket. The sight of his father, an 85-year-old decorated Marine, sprawled on the ground, ignited a storm of emotions within him. Fear, anger, and a piercing guilt that he hadn't been there to prevent this. "Dad," he whispered, his voice taut with barely restrained emotion. "Are you hurt?" His throat tightened as he scanned his father's face, searching for signs of pain or worse. Frank's weathered eyes met his son's, and despite the blood trickling from his nose and the bruise blooming on his cheek, he managed a faint, reassuring smile. "Only my pride, son," he said, his voice gravelly but steady. "Nothing broken." The words were meant to ease Matt's worry, but they only deepened the ache in his chest. Frank had always been a pillar of strength, a man who'd faced wars and walked away with medals pinned to his chest, yet here he was, vulnerable, brought low by a senseless act. Matt swallowed hard, forcing back the lump in his throat, and nodded. He rose to his feet, his movements deliberate, though his mind raced with a mix of protectiveness and fury. His gaze swept across the parking lot and landed on Louise Thompson, the store clerk who stood just outside the supermarket's glass doors. Luis's face was a mask of hesitation, his dark eyes flickering with uncertainty and a hint of fear. He'd seen everything, the biker's fist, Frank's fall, the crowd's indifference, but he wasn't sure where he fit in this unfolding drama. Then, as if steeling himself, Luis took a tentative step forward and pointed toward a group of bikers lounging against the far wall of the plaza. "There, he said, his voice quiet but firm, the single word carrying the weight of accusation. Matt didn't pause to think. His soldier's instincts kicked in, sharp and unyielding, as he strode toward the bikers. Behind him, his unit, men and women who'd served alongside him through deployments and drills, fell into step without a word. Their movements were synchronized, a silent show of unity that spoke louder than any shouted command. The biker who'd thrown the punch, a broad-shouldered man with a leather vest and a cocky grin, noticed their approach. His posture shifted, the casual slouch giving way to a defensive stance. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the bravado he'd felt moments earlier when he'd struck an elderly man without a second thought. But as Matt and his soldiers drew closer, the biker's eyes betrayed him, darting nervously over the uniforms, the disciplined formation, the unspoken promise of consequence. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, but his voice cracked, revealing the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Matt stopped a few feet away, his expression calm but unyielding. He reached into his pocket and produced his military ID, holding it up with a steady hand. "I'm the man whose father you assaulted," he said, his voice low and even, but laced with an edge that cut through the air like a blade. The words landed like a physical blow, and for a moment the biker's bravado faltered. His eyes flicked to the ID, then to the soldiers spread out across the parking lot, their relaxed yet ready postures a stark contrast to the chaos he'd caused. A heavy silence settled over the scene, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart pound. For the first time that day, the biker realized this wasn't a moment he could laugh off or walk away from. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a tightness in his jaw as he processed the gravity of his actions. He glanced at his friends, who stood nearby, their earlier jeers and laughter now conspicuously absent. The soldier's presence was a message in itself. This wasn't a minor scuffle to be ignored. These were trained servicemen and women, not mall cops or passersby who'd looked the other way. They stood at ease, but their readiness was unmistakable, a quiet promise that justice would be served. Matt took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though it carried the weight of authority. "You hit a decorated Marine," he said, each word deliberate. "An 85-year-old man, my father." The biker's face paled, his bravado crumbling like dry sand. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Matt's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying, but his control unshaken. "That's the problem," he cut in, his tone sharp but still measured. "You didn't care." Before the situation could escalate into violence or chaos, Matt reached for the radio clipped to his belt. With the same calm precision he'd honed over years of service, he contacted local law enforcement. "This is Captain Matt Harris, requesting officers at Lincoln Plaza," he said, his voice steady. "Civilian assault, witnesses present, victim is a military veteran." The call was clear, professional, and left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't a request that could be brushed aside. Minutes later, the piercing wail of sirens sliced through the stillness, and two patrol cars rolled into the parking lot, their lights flashing red and blue against the fading daylight. The officers who stepped out were the same ones who might have dismissed a call about a minor altercation earlier in the day, but the scene before them now demanded their attention. Uniformed soldiers stood in formation. A crowd of onlookers watched in hushed anticipation, and Matt Harris, a commander with an air of quiet authority, stood at the center of it all. There was no ignoring this. Matt didn't raise his voice or make demands. He simply handed over the witness statements, provided the store's surveillance footage, and briefed the officers with the same calm efficiency he'd used in countless military operations. The evidence was airtight, the witnesses unwavering, and the biker's guilt undeniable. The officers moved swiftly, cuffing the biker with minimal fuss. He didn't resist, his earlier defiance replaced by a resigned slump of his shoulders. His friends watched in silence, their faces a mix of shame and unease, as the reality of their complicity sank in. As the biker was led to the squad car, a shift rippled through the crowd. A few shoppers who had earlier turned their backs, unwilling to get involved, now stepped forward. They weren't there to interfere, but to bear witness, to acknowledge what they'd been too hesitant to confront before. Luis Thompson stood among them, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes locked on the scene. He hadn't said much throughout the ordeal, but his presence spoke volumes. In that moment, he stood taller than anyone, a quiet pillar of resolve in a world that had momentarily lost its way. Matt returned to his father's side, kneeling once more. From one of the Humvees parked nearby, he retrieved a small first aid kit. With hands that had handled rifles and radios in war zones, he now cleaned the blood from Frank's nose and lip with a tenderness that belied his military training. Each movement was careful, deliberate, as if he could somehow erase the pain his father had endured. "I should have been here sooner," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. The weight of those words hung between them, a son's unspoken fear that he'd failed the man who'd raised him. Frank shook his head, his eyes softening with a warmth that only a father could muster. "You were where you needed to be," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "So was I." The words were simple, but they carried a lifetime of understanding, a bond forged through years of sacrifice and unspoken love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot, something changed in the crowd. An older man, his Korean war cap slightly faded but worn with pride, stepped forward. He stood at attention, his posture rigid with the discipline of a bygone era, and raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. The gesture was a quiet tribute, not just to Frank but to the values he represented. One by one others followed, a note asked, a raised hand, a silent acknowledgement of the man who'd stood tall despite the blow, and the son who'd stood by him. The plaza, once heavy with tension, now hummed with a quiet reverence, a shared moment of humanity reclaimed. The crowd had gathered in the parking lot, a mix of men and women, young and old, veterans with weathered faces and civilians who'd once turned away, their eyes now wide with a clarity born of shame and awe. A hush settled over them, not the kind that feels hollow, but one heavy with reverence, like a blanket draped gently over a soldier's shoulders after a long, cold march. It enveloped Frank Harris, a man whose heart had grown accustomed to solitude, wrapping him in a warmth he hadn't known he'd been craving for decades. His son, Matt, stood tall beside him, his chest tight with pride as the fading sunlight glinted off the golden emblem on Frank's Marine cap, casting a soft glow that seemed to sanctify the moment. Matt's gaze swept across the lot, once just a stretch of cracked concrete and apathy, now a hallowed ground where a forgotten truth had been unearthed. Justice had arrived, not with the fire of vengeance, but with the quiet dignity of honor restored. Frank's mind drifted as he stood there, his calloused hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. He hadn't asked for this, not the attention, not the reckoning. The assault that had brought them all here had been a fleeting, brutal moment, a stranger's fist striking his face in a flare of senseless rage. But it wasn't the pain that lingered in Frank's memory. It was the way the world had seemed to pause afterward, as if the universe itself demanded a moment to acknowledge what had been done. He'd felt the weight of his years in that silence. Vietnam's jungles, Iraq's searing deserts, Afghanistan's jagged mountains. All those battles, all that sacrifice. And yet, for so long, he'd been invisible, a ghost in his own hometown. Now, as he looked out at the faces before him, some tear-streaked, others resolute, he felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar. Not just gratitude, but a sense of belonging. Matt, too, was wrestling with his own emotions. As a captain in the Marines, he'd seen his share of loss and triumph, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of his father, a man of unyielding strength, brought low by a coward's blow. The anger had burned hot in Matt's chest at first, a fire that threatened to consume him. But standing here now, watching the community rally around Frank, he felt that fury give way to something deeper, a fierce, protective love, mingled with gratitude for the chance to see his father honored in a way he'd never sought but always deserved. Matt's eyes lingered on the cap his father wore, its emblem, a symbol of a life given to duty, and he vowed silently to ensure this moment wasn't fleeting. The story might have ended there in that parking lot, a quiet victory sealed by the setting sun. But some moments refused to be contained, their ripples spreading far beyond their origins. Word of what happened to Franklin Harris, the assault, the military's swift response, the silent salute that followed, traveled beyond the town's borders, carried by whispers and shared stories. A bystander's shaky video, raw and unpolished, captured more than the violence. It held a truth that had been buried too long, that honor still mattered, that it could rise from the ashes of neglect and demand to be seen. Posted online, the footage spread like wildfire, each view stoking a collective awakening. Within days, messages began to pour in, a deluge of support that overwhelmed Frank's quiet life. Handwritten letters arrived, their envelopes bearing postmarks from distant states, each one filled with words of admiration and regret from strangers who felt they'd failed men like him. Emails flooded his inbox, some from veterans who saw their own struggles mirrored in his story, others from civilians who promised to never look away again. Children sent crayon drawings of American flags, their wobbly lines and bright colors a testament to the innocence that still believed in heroes. Veterans from across the country reached out, their voices a chorus of anger, gratitude, and solidarity. Each message chipped away at the walls Frank had built around his heart, leaving him both humbled and unsteady, unsure how to carry the weight of so much love. But no message cut deeper than the one from the local American Legion chapter. "We want to recognize what you stood for, Frank," they wrote. "Not just in war, but in peace." The words struck him like a bullet, piercing the armor of his stoicism. Frank had never been one for fanfare. His service had been a quiet act of duty, not a bid for glory. The idea of a public tribute made him uneasy, his first instinct to retreat back into the shadows where he'd lived for so long. He sat with the letter for hours, tracing the words with his fingers, his mind a battlefield of pride and reluctance. What right did he have to accept such an honor when so many others had given more and received less? Matt saw the turmoil in his father's eyes and felt a pang of empathy. As a commander in a different kind of war, he understood the burden of leadership, in the way duty could weigh heavier than any medal. But he also knew this wasn't about ego. It was about legacy, about ensuring that men like Frank weren't forgotten. "Dad," he said softly one evening, sitting across from him in their modest living room, "this isn't just for you. It's for every veteran who's ever felt invisible. It's about showing people what it means to remember." Matt's voice was steady, but his heart raced, hoping his words would reach the man who'd taught him everything about courage. Frank looked at his son, seeing not just the Marine captain, but the boy who'd once clung to his leg, begging for stories of far-off battles. He saw the pride in Matt's eyes, the quiet plea for him to accept this moment. And so, with a slow nod, Frank agreed, though his heart still trembled at the thought of standing in the spotlight. 2 weeks later, the town gathered at the Civic Auditorium, a cavernous space that seemed too small to contain the swell of emotion within its walls. What had begun as a modest tribute had snowballed into a standing-room-only event, drawing local leaders, military personnel, school children clutching handmade signs, and veterans whose faces bore the scars of wars both seen and unseen. Rows of chairs gave way to crowds pressed against the walls, their murmurs a low hum of anticipation. On stage, a simple wooden podium stood beneath a banner that read, "Service, Sacrifice, Sympathy." The words felt alive, pulsing with the weight of what was to come. The mayor took the stage first, his voice cracking with emotion as he addressed the crowd. He spoke not only of the assault that had sparked this gathering, but of the decades that had preceded it, the years Frank had carried his service in silence, unnoticed by the very community he'd fought for. "Mr. Harris didn't just serve in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan," the mayor said, his eyes glistening. "He served when he came home, in the quiet moments no one saw. Today, we break that silence." His words hung in the air, a call to action that stirred the audience's hearts. The master of ceremonies stepped forward next, a retired colonel whose voice carried the authority of experience. He read aloud Frank's record, 32 years in the United States Marine Corps, 3 major campaigns, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a quiet act of heroism in Kandahar that had saved 9 men. Each accolade landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Some wiped tears from their cheeks, others bowed their heads in reverence, and a few reached for the hands of those beside them, seeking solace in shared emotion. Frank sat in his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on the floor, his Marine cap clutched tightly in his hands. The weight of their gaze was almost too much to bear, a mix of gratitude and guilt swirling in his chest. He hadn't asked to be a hero, he'd only done what needed doing. When his name was finally called, the crowd rose as one, their applause a thunder that shook the auditorium. It didn't fade quickly. It grew, swelling into something more than sound, a collective act of atonement for the years of neglect. Frank's throat tightened as he wheeled himself to the stage, his hands trembling not from age, but from the overwhelming sense of being seen. Matt followed, his steps measured, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and humility. As he reached his father, Matt knelt, not as a commander but as a son, his eyes locked on Frank's. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them filled with a lifetime of unspoken love. Then Matt placed a new medal in his father's hand, its weight a symbol of recognition long overdue. Leaning into the microphone, Matt's voice was steady but thick with emotion. "You fought for our freedom," he said, his words carrying to every corner of the room. "Today, we fight for your honor." The crowd erupted again, their cheers a catharsis, a promise to do better. Frank looked down at the medal, its surface catching the stage lights, and for the first time in years, he let the tears fall. They weren't born of pain or sorrow, but of a profound relief. The relief of finally being seen, not as a relic of wars past, but as a man whose sacrifice still mattered. No one expected what happened next. In the quiet aftermath of the ceremony, Franklin Harris, a weathered Marine veteran, found himself staring at an unexpected letter from the courthouse. It wasn't a summons from a judge or a bureaucratic notice. Instead, it bore the jagged handwriting of Derek Blay Morgan, the biker whose fist had met Frank's face in a fleeting moment of rage in a parking lot. Frank's hands, toughened by years of service and life's relentless grind, trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. He read it once, then again, each word sinking deeper into his chest. The letter was raw, unpolished, but beneath the rough script, Frank sensed a current of shame and sincerity that stirred something in him. "Sir," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm asking to meet you face to face before my sentencing. No cameras, no excuses, just the truth." Frank's first instinct was to crumple the letter and walk away. The bruise on his cheek had faded, but the memory of Derek's leather-clad figure, eyes wild with anger, lingered like a stubborn shadow. Why should he give this man another moment of his time? Yet, as he sat in his modest living room, the walls adorned with faded photos of his Marine days, a voice from his past, a drill sergeant's bark, perhaps, or his own stubborn conscience, whispered a truth he couldn't ignore. We don't just fight enemies. Sometimes we help them stop being one. It was the Marine in him, the part that had faced fear and loss and still believed in redemption, that nudged him to agree. The meeting took place in a stark, windowless room at the courthouse, a space that felt like it was holding its breath. No reporters, no guards in crisp uniforms, just 2 men, each carrying the weight of their own wars. Frank arrived first, his posture straight despite the ache in his knees, his eyes steady but guarded. When Derek walked in, Frank barely recognized him. Gone was the swaggering biker from the parking lot, the one with the leather vest in the snarl. In his place was a man in plain jeans and a worn t-shirt, his broad shoulders hunched, his face etched with lines of regret that seemed to age him beyond his years. Derek sat across from Frank, the metal table between them a cold barrier, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken questions and pain. Finally, Derek cleared his throat, his voice low and unsteady. "My dad was a Vietnam vet," he began, his eyes fixed on the table as if it had held the answers he was searching for. "He came back, broken, angry, drank too much, took it out on me and my mom. I grew up blaming the military for what it did to him. for what it turned him into. His voice cracked, and he paused, swallowing hard. Frank watched him, his own heart tightening. He knew that kind of pain, the kind that festers in families torn apart by war's long shadow. When I saw you in that veteran's jacket, Derek continued, his gaze flickering up to meet Frank's, I didn't see you. I saw him. All that anger, all that hurt, it just exploded. I was wrong, Mr. Harris. I was so wrong. His eyes were red, glistening with tears he fought to hold back. I don't expect you to care, but I've started therapy, signed up to volunteer at the VA too, no matter what the judge says. I needed you to know. Frank leaned back in his chair, his calloused hands folded tightly in his lap. He felt a storm of emotions, anger at the memory of that punch, pity for the man sitting before him, and something else, something softer, like the flicker of hope he hadn't realized he still carried. He thought of his own battles, not just on foreign soil, but in the quiet moments of doubt and loss that followed. You can't undo what happened, Frank said, his voice steady but gentle, like a father speaking to a wayward son. But you get to decide what comes next. That's the only power any of us have. Then in a moment that seemed to still the air itself, Frank reached across the table and placed a hand on Derek's arm. The gesture was simple but profound, a bridge between two men who had every reason to stay divided. Don't waste this pain, Frank said, his eyes locked on Derek's. Turn it into something worth living for. Behind the one-way glass, the court staff watched, their whispers falling silent as they witnessed the exchange. The judge, later informed of the meeting and Derek's proactive steps toward amends, was moved. Instead of a harsh sentence, he ordered probation, mandatory counseling, and 500 hours of community service at the VA hospital. But Derek didn't just meet the requirements, he poured himself into them. He arrived at the hospital before dawn, his boots echoing in the quiet halls. He pushed elderly veterans in wheelchairs to their appointments, their frail hands gripping his arm with trust. He scrubbed floors until they gleamed, delivered trays of lukewarm hospital meals with a smile, and listened, really listened, when the veterans shared stories of their own battles. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward redemption, a way to chip away at the guilt that still gnawed at him. Months later, at the town's Veterans Day parade, Derek stood beside Frank, not as a symbol of violence, but as living proof that hearts can change. The crowd's cheers washed over them, but Derek's focus was on the man next to him, the one who had given him a chance when he deserved none. When a young boy in the crowd pointed at Derek's tattooed arms and asked, "Are you a soldier?" Derek's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. He glanced at Frank, who gave him a slight nod, as if passing a torch. "No, kid," Derek said, his voice soft but steady, "but I'm learning what it means to serve." Frank Harris had never sought the spotlight. He'd always imagined his later years would be simple, sipping black coffee at dawn, taking short walks to clear his mind, folding his grocery list with the precision of a man who valued order. But life, as it often does, had other plans. After the ceremony and Derek's public apology, the town began to see Frank not just as a veteran, but as a quiet force of wisdom. It started small. An invitation from the local elementary school to speak during a history class. The principal expected a few war stories, maybe a quick salute to patriotism, but Frank had no interest in glorifying battles. Instead, he stood before the wide-eyed students and spoke of loyalty, the kind that binds people through the darkest times. He talked about holding the line, not just in war, but in life, even when no one notices or thanks you. He spoke of the difference between bravery and kindness, how the latter often takes more courage. The children listened, their usual fidgeting replaced by a stillness that surprised their teachers. When Frank finished, a little girl raised her hand, her voice small but clear. "Mr. Harris," she asked, "how do you know when you are brave enough?" Frank's heart swelled, and he knelt down to meet her gaze. "You don't," he said. "You just keep trying, every day." In the quiet of a crisp morning, a young girl, her eyes wide with curiosity, clasped Frank Harris's weathered hand. Her small voice trembled with a question that seemed too big for her years. "Do heroes ever feel lonely?" Frank, a man whose face bore the lines of countless unspoken stories, paused. His heart, heavy with the weight of memories, softened at her innocence. He knelt slightly, his old Marine cap tilting forward, and offered a smile that carried both warmth and a flicker of sorrow. "Only when folks forget to see them," he said, his voice low, like a breeze rustling through fallen leaves. In that moment, he wasn't just answering her question. He was unburdening a truth he'd carried for decades. A truth about the quiet ache of being overlooked, of serving a world that sometimes turned its gaze away. Word of Frank's quiet wisdom spread like wildfire through the small town. It wasn't long before other schools reached out, eager to have him speak to their students. Local radio stations called, their hosts captivated by the story of a man who had served in silence and now carried a legacy of dignity. A veterans outreach group, recognizing the depth of his experience, invited him to join their advisory board. Even the police department, moved by his story, sought his guidance. They wanted him to train officers, to help them understand the invisible scars many older veterans carried. PTSD, the weight of trauma, the simple yet profound need for respect in everyday moments. Frank, though, wasn't a man who craved the spotlight. Attention felt foreign, almost heavy, but he accepted the responsibility with the same quiet resolve that had guided him through his years of service. He met with the rookie officers, their faces a mix of eagerness and uncertainty, and delivered a message that cut through the noise of their training. Your job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to protect the people who once protected you. Those words lingered, sinking deep into the hearts of those who heard them, a reminder of a debt too often forgotten. Captain Matt Harris, Frank's son, had recently been promoted to a regional leadership post. His chest swelled with pride, not just for his own accomplishments, but for the man his father was. Together, they poured their hearts into a new initiative, a pilot program called Operation Honor. Its mission was simple yet profound: to connect retired veterans with high school seniors, pairing the wisdom of age with the boundless energy of youth, weaving stories of sacrifice into the promise of the future. The program became a bridge, a way to ensure that the legacies of men and women like Frank would never fade into the background. It was a labor of love, born from Matt's deep respect for his father and a shared belief that no veteran should ever feel invisible. Even Derek Morgan, the young man whose fist had once collided with Frank's jaw in a moment of reckless anger, found himself changed by the older man's grace. After completing his court-ordered community service, Derek didn't walk away. Something in Frank's forgiveness had stirred a longing in him, a desire to be more than the man he'd been. He became a volunteer coordinator at the VA, dedicating himself to helping veterans with the small but vital tasks, driving them to appointments, assisting with check-ins, offering a steady hand and a listening ear. To Derek, every interaction was a chance to honor the second chance Frank had given him. "He showed me how to be the kind of man my dad would have been proud of," Derek would say, his voice thick with gratitude. In Frank, he saw not just a veteran, but a beacon of what it meant to rise above pain and choose purpose over resentment. But Frank's true impact wasn't measured in the classrooms he spoke in or the council meetings he attended. It was in the quiet, fleeting moments that carried the weight of a lifetime. Strangers stopped him in the park, their hands outstretched, their eyes filled with respect as they shook his hand. Parents walking with their children would point him out, their voices hushed with reverence. "That's the man who helped make this country what it is," they'd whisper, and their words were like a balm to Frank's soul. He had spent so many years feeling unseen, just another gray-haired veteran sitting quietly in diners, waiting rooms, or bus stops. Now, because of his quiet strength, others like him were noticed too. The respect he restored wasn't just for himself. It was for every veteran who had ever felt forgotten, their sacrifices fading into the background of a busy world. One morning, as Frank sat on a park bench, sipping coffee from a worn thermos, a teenager approached. The boy's steps were hesitant, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "were you really a hero?" Frank looked up, his eyes gentle but resolute, the weight of his past shimmering behind them. "No," he replied, his voice steady but humble, "but I served with a few, and I remember them." With that, he tipped his old Marine cap, a gesture not for himself but for the countless others whose legacies he carried in his heart. It was a small act, but it held the gravity of a lifetime spent honoring those who had stood beside him. One quiet morning, a street sign went up in the town. Veteran Franklin Harris Way. There was no fanfare, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no speeches to mark the occasion, just a simple nod from a grateful community to a man who had never asked for recognition. Frank passed by the sign often, his hands tucked into his pockets, his cap resting lightly on his head. He didn't stop to admire it. To him, it wasn't about the name on the sign. It was about the lives he'd touched, the stories he'd helped others see. Life had slowed for Frank, but the meaning in his days had only grown richer. At the park, children now waved to him, their smiles bright with recognition. Young men lingered to hear his stories, drawn to the quiet wisdom in his words. He carried a presence now, not because of the punch that had once brought him attention, nor because of the military convoy that had honored him, but because of how he had responded, with dignity instead of anger, with forgiveness instead of pride. Frank often said the greatest lesson he'd learned in uniform wasn't how to fight, it was how to stand tall when the world turned its back. That lesson, forged in the crucible of his service, had become his guiding star. And now others were learning to look again, to see the veterans who had always been there, their quiet strength a cornerstone of the nation. Across town, Derek Morgan continued his work at the VA, pushing wheelchairs, listening to stories, and treating every veteran like their words were gold. He had been transformed not just by Frank's forgiveness, but by the way the older man lived, a life that said every person mattered, every story deserved to be heard. On Veterans Day, as the town gathered beneath the golden glow of autumn leaves, Frank stood beneath the flag. His salute was slow, deliberate, a gesture heavy with decades of memory. As he lowered his hand, he whispered a promise he'd carried since his days in uniform. "I didn't forget you." It was a vow to the men and women he'd served with, to the ones who never came home, to the ones who still carried their battles in silence. And now, because of Frank, the town wouldn't forget either. His legacy wasn't in the sign that bore his name or the programs he'd inspired. It was in the way he'd shown a community to see, to honor, to remember. Frank Harris carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed to belong to another era, a time when honor wasn't just a word but a way of life etched into the soul. At 78, his steps were slower now, his shoulders slightly stooped from years of carrying burdens both visible and unseen. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much war, loss, and the slow erosion of a world that once seemed to value men like him. Yet his pale blue eyes still held a spark, a flicker of resolve that refused to dim, even in a society that often looked past him, rendering him invisible. To the young, he was just another old man shuffling through the grocery store or sitting alone at the diner counter, nursing a black coffee. But Frank was more than that. He was a veteran, a survivor of battles fought on foreign soil, a man who had once stood tall in defense of ideals he still held dear. And in his heart, he carried a truth. Honor wasn't something you outgrew, no matter how gray your hair or how heavy your steps. It was a code you lived by, even when the world stopped noticing. In the small town of Willow Creek, where life moved at the pace of lazy summer afternoons, Frank's presence was a familiar one. He'd nod politely to neighbors, tip his faded baseball cap to passersby, and offer a kind word to anyone who bothered to meet his gaze. But beneath his gentle exterior, Frank wrestled with a quiet ache. He felt the weight of being overlooked, the sting of a society that seemed to have little use for elders like him. He'd overhear snippets of conversation at the local barbershop, young folks complaining about boomers or joking about old-timers who couldn't keep up with the times. Each careless word chipped away at him, though he'd never let it show. Frank wasn't one to dwell on self-pity. He'd seen worse than indifference in his lifetime, far worse. Still, he couldn't help but wonder, had the world forgotten how to truly see one another? Did anyone still care about the sacrifices of those who had come before? The incident that would ripple through Willow Creek began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the air smelled of fresh-cut grass and the sun cast long shadows across Main Street. Frank was walking home from the post office, a few letters tucked under his arm, when he passed a group of teenagers loitering outside the convenience store. They were loud, their laughter sharp and careless, their energy spilling over like a river bursting its banks. Among them was Tyler Reed, a lanky 17-year-old with a chip on his shoulder and a reputation for trouble. Tyler's life hadn't been easy. His father had walked out years ago, leaving him and his mother to scrape by. That pain had hardened into anger, a restless fury that Tyler directed at anyone who crossed his path. On this particular morning, his eyes locked onto Frank, and something in the old man's steady gait seemed to ignite a spark of defiance in him. "Hey, Grandpa," Tyler called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's with the limp? You fall off your rocker or something?" His friend snickered, egging him on. Frank paused, his heart sinking, but his face betraying nothing. He'd heard worse in his time, far worse. But the cruelty in Tyler's tone cut deeper than he expected, stirring memories of a younger self who'd once faced down fear with nothing but courage and a rifle. For a moment, Frank considered responding, but he swallowed the urge. Instead, he offered a small nod as if to say, "I see you, kid, even if you don't see me." Then he continued on his way, the jeers fading behind him. Tyler, however, wasn't done. Emboldened by his friend's laughter, he jogged after Frank, blocking his path. "What's the matter, old man? Too good to talk to us?" he taunted, puffing out his chest. Frank stopped, his grip tightening on the letters in his hand. He felt a flicker of anger, hot and unfamiliar, but he pushed it down. He saw something in Tyler's eyes, something beyond the bravado. It was pain, raw and unhealed, masquerading as bravado. Frank had seen that look before, in the faces of young soldiers who had lost too much too soon. "Son," he said softly, his voice steady but kind, "I don't want trouble. Let's both just go on with our day." His words were calm, but they carried the weight of a man who'd faced down worse than a teenage bully and come out the other side. Tyler hesitated, caught off guard by Frank's composure. For a split second, shame flickered across his face, but his friend's laughter snapped him back to his role as the tough guy. "Whatever," he muttered, shoving past Frank with just enough force to make the old man stumble. The letters slipped from Frank's hand, fluttering to the sidewalk like fallen leaves. Tyler didn't look back as he rejoined his friends, their cheers echoing down the street. Frank knelt slowly, his knees protesting, and gathered the letters one by one. He felt the eyes of a few passersby on him, some pitying, some indifferent, but no one stopped to help. As he stood, he brushed off his pants and continued home, his heart heavy, but his resolve unbroken. He wouldn't let this moment define him. He'd faced cruelty before, and he'd learned long ago that responding with hate only deepened the wound. Word of the incident spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By evening, the story had reached the local diner, where folks gathered over plates of meatloaf and cups of decaf to trade gossip. Most were outraged. "That Reed boy's got no respect," grumbled Mr. Thompson, a retired mechanic who'd known Frank for decades. "Someone ought to teach him a lesson." Others shook their heads, lamenting the state of the younger generation. But beneath the anger was something deeper, a collective unease, a realization that Tyler's cruelty wasn't just about one kid acting out. It was a symptom of something larger, a town that had grown too comfortable ignoring its elders, too quick to dismiss the quiet heroes who walked among them. Frank, meanwhile, sat alone in his modest living room, the glow of a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. He held a framed photo of his younger self in uniform, surrounded by his platoon, men who'd become brothers, some of whom never made it home. He traced their faces with a trembling finger, his thoughts drifting to the boy who'd mocked him. Tyler's anger had felt personal, but Frank knew better. It was the anger of a world that had stopped listening, a world that had forgotten the value of sacrifice. Frank didn't hate Tyler, he pitied him, and in that pity, he found a spark of purpose. He wouldn't let this moment pass without trying to make it mean something. The next morning, Frank did something unexpected. Instead of retreating into the quiet routine of his days, he walked to the community center where the town's veterans often gathered. He spoke to a few old friends, men and women who, like him, carried the weight of their service in their bones. Together, they hatched a plan, not to shame Tyler, but to reach him. They decided to host a town hall meeting, a chance for veterans to share their stories and for the community to listen. Frank didn't want revenge, he wanted understanding. He wanted Tyler, and kids like him, to see that strength wasn't about pushing others down, but about lifting them up, even when it hurt. The town hall was announced with flyers posted at the diner, the library, and the gas station. At first, folks were skeptical. "Who's got time for that?" they muttered. But curiosity and perhaps a touch of guilt drew them in. On the evening of the event, the community center was packed. Families, shopkeepers, even a few of Tyler's classmates. Tyler himself stood at the back, dragged along by his mother, his face a storm of resentment and unease. He didn't want to be here, surrounded by people who probably knew what he'd done. But as he leaned against the wall, arms crossed, something in the air caught his attention. The quiet power of the men and women taking the stage. Frank spoke first, his voice steady but laced with emotion. He didn't mention Tyler or the incident. Instead, he told stories of his time in the war, moments of fear, of camaraderie, of loss so profound it had nearly broken him. He spoke of coming home to a world that didn't always know how to welcome him back, of learning to live with memories that never faded. He talked about the honor that kept him going, the belief that every person deserved respect, no matter how young or old, broken or whole. As he spoke, the room grew still. People leaned forward, some wiping tears, others nodding in recognition. Tyler, despite himself, felt a lump in his throat. For the first time he saw Frank not as an old man to be mocked, but as someone who'd carried a weight Tyler couldn't begin to understand. Other veterans followed, each sharing pieces of their lives, stories of sacrifice, of resilience, of finding purpose in service. The audience listened, rapt, as the invisible scars of these men and women became visible, if only for a moment. By the time the last speaker stepped down, the room was thick with emotion. Then, in a moment that felt both spontaneous and inevitable, Frank stood again. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze soft but unwavering, and caught Tyler's eyes. "This isn't about the past," he said. "It's about what we do now. It's about seeing each other, really seeing, and choosing to act with kindness, even when it's hard. That's what makes a community. That's what makes us human." The words landed on Tyler. They stripped away his defenses, leaving him raw and vulnerable. He thought of his own anger, his own pain, the way he'd lashed out at a man who'd done nothing to deserve it. Shame burned in his chest, but for the first time, it wasn't just shame. It was a longing to be better, to be someone his mother could be proud of, someone he could be proud of himself. As the crowd applauded, Tyler slipped out the back door, his mind a tumult of emotions. He didn't know how to fix what he'd done, but he knew he had to try him. In the days that followed, Willow Creek began to stir. The town hall meeting had cracked open a fault line, exposing truths the community hadn't wanted to face. Neighbors started checking in on elderly residents, offering rides to appointments, or simply sitting on porches to listen to their stories. Kids at the high school launched an oral history project, recording interviews with local veterans. And Frank, though he hadn't sought the spotlight, found himself at the center of it all, a quiet beacon of grace in a town rediscovering its heart. Tyler, for his part, wrestled with his guilt. He avoided Frank at first, too ashamed to face him. But one crisp morning, driven by a courage he didn't know he had, he knocked on Frank's door. When Frank opened it, his face showed no anger, only a quiet welcome. "Come in, son," he said, as if he'd been expecting him. Tyler stammered an apology, his voice thick with emotion. He admitted his shame, his anger, his fear of never being more than the troublemaker everyone thought he was. Frank listened, his heart aching for the boy in front of him, a boy who reminded him of the young men he'd once led, full of fire but searching for purpose. "I didn't mean to disrespect you," Tyler said, his eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't know who you were." "You didn't need to know," Frank replied gently. "Respect isn't about what someone's done. It's about who they are. And you, Tyler, you're someone who can choose to do better." Those words stayed with Tyler. They gave him something to hold on to, a lifeline in a world that had often felt like it was slipping away. He started volunteering at the community center, helping with veterans programs, listening to their stories with a reverence he'd never known he could feel. He wasn't perfect. He still had his temper, his struggles, but he was trying. And in trying, he found a small piece of the honor Frank had spoken of, a piece that felt like it could be his own. Willow Creek changed because of that day. Not overnight, but in the slow, steady ways that matter most. People started looking up from their phones, noticing the elders among them, the veterans, the quiet heroes who'd always been there. They taught their kids that strength wasn't about being the toughest guy in the room, but about being the one who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. Frank's grace in the face of cruelty had sparked something, a reminder that honor wasn't belonged to one person. It belonged to everyone who chose to live it. And Frank? He carried on as he always had, tipping his cap, offering kind words, living his quiet truth. But now he felt a little less invisible. He saw it in the smiles of his neighbors, the respect in their eyes, the way they'd stop to ask how his day was going. He knew he hadn't done anything extraordinary, just stayed true to himself. But maybe he thought that was the point. Maybe change didn't start with grand gestures or clenched fists, but with the simple, stubborn act of seeing someone, really seeing them, and choosing to honor them, no matter what.